Shez and Ariana often liked to say that she had been born with a skeptical mind. As far back as she could remember, nothing thrilled her more than poking holes in tall tales. She had built a career out of dissecting myths and legends, only to reveal the far more mundane explanations beneath them. In her youth, she had already shown a remarkable talent for picking apart stories presented as unbelievable, and this talent had led her all the way to the frontier of the Galactic Union's research facilities, where the strangest narratives of the known galaxy converged. She was Ilori by birth, a species known for slender builds, pale skin, and a delicate pair of additional pupils in each eye. Unlike many Ilori, whose temperament leaned toward contemplation without confrontation, Shezin enjoyed a certain degree of challenge. Her colleagues called her determined, though others might have called her stubborn. The woman herself didn't care which it was. She had a job to do, and she found it exhilarating. That job currently took place on Athena Edge, a research station perched near the rim of an asteroid cluster no one outside the academic community had ever cared to name. The station was large but far from luxurious, built inside the shell of a spinning habitat module. It housed a few hundred researchers and support staff, each assigned to some corner of knowledge that the Galactic Union deemed worth exploring. Shezin's corner was the study of mythic accounts, mostly gleaned from planet-hopping travelers, archived data crystals, or interviews with xenobiologists and historians stationed here. Officially, Shezin was an anthropologist-linguist specializing in cultural legends. Unofficially, she liked to call herself a professional bubble burster. She had an entire digital library of so-called incredible feats, each one connected to stories that allegedly showcased the impossible. And in the last year, her focus had narrowed to a single subject that was repeatedly cropping up in the archives: the legends involving a certain species called humans. Or, in standard parlance, Terrans. As Shezin often joked with her team, humans were simply smaller bipedal creatures from a single standard gravity planet that historically had only joined the Galactic Union in recent centuries. Yet, they were credited with improbable acts, lifting multi-ton vehicles to save children, trekking across entire deserts unaided, or temporarily surviving in vacuums. Shezin found it fascinating and contradictory, like a comedic footnote in a galaxy brimming with species far stronger, taller, or more robust than humans. She had spent months compiling a large treatise on these claims, determined to prove they were nothing but folk tales, distorting more mundane truths. At the moment, she was in her office, a rather cramped space lined with display panels, reviewing the last few chapters of her report. If she pressed herself, she would have it done within a week, just in time to meet the deadlines set by the Union Science Council. She sipped a mildly sweet beverage while glancing over the paragraphs on her holoscreen. Each entry debunked a story she had once believed to be a direct human narrative of impossible feats. But after analyzing them, she found alternative explanations, errors in historical documentation, exaggerations in local folklore, or unreliable eyewitnesses overwhelmed by adrenaline. Yes, she thought, this is quite thorough. And once the council saw it, any illusions of humans as super beings would be firmly put to rest. She was imagining how her final presentation would go when her door panel chimed. The beep was urgent, cutting through her concentration. She touched the console to let the visitor in, and in stepped her research assistant, an Yudari female named Ina, who had slender tentacles in place of arms and large cobalt eyes that almost glowed under the station's artificial lighting. "Dr. Ariana," Ina said without preamble, "there's news from the exploration team that just returned from Delta 7. Delta 7 was a smaller asteroid in the cluster, a place rumored to hide the remains of many ancient vessels." Shezin had heard vague talk of a derelict structure possibly linked to a human ship from centuries ago. She had assumed it was overblown nonsense. "What do we know?" Shezin asked, leaning back in her seat. Ina gestured with a free tentacle at the data pad she carried. "They found a partial hull, severely corroded, but it may date back to the Earth exploration era, somewhere in the 27th century. If it truly is from Earth," Shezin said with a faint smirk. I suspect we'll find a normal cargo vessel that got lost. Let me guess, it'll be just the same old story. A couple of fragments with no real significance. That's what I thought too, Ina admitted. But the initial scans detected a faint biosignature, though extremely degraded. It matches the pattern of human genetic material. That gave Shezin pause. Hey, biosignature? That's not typical, especially after so long. They want you to be part of the salvage analysis, Ina said. Commander Tarek insisted that your expertise in human legends could help interpret any data modules they find. Shezin let out a small laugh. Me specifically? He's aware my expertise is focused on debunking, not believing. But fine, I suppose it can't hurt to see this for myself. Maybe we'll find one more tall tale to add to my paper. She rose from her seat, smoothed her pale tunic, and nodded for Ina to lead the way. They took a station tram to the docking bay, where a small briefing took place. A few of the station's interdisciplinary team members, an Odari engineer, 2 Haloran security officers, an El-Thani pilot, were present, looking up at a large holo display that showed partial images of the discovered wreck. It had the characteristic blocky silhouette of old Terran ships, battered by centuries of cosmic debris. The commander gave them all instructions to fly out and do a more thorough investigation, accompanied by the pilot. He included Shezin's name on the roster, emphasizing they might need interpretative help if they encountered cryptic logs or cultural relics. Although Shezin was tempted to roll her eyes, she hardly believed there would be anything truly mind-blowing. She nevertheless felt a spark of academic curiosity. This might be an actual relic of early Earth space travel, albeit one that had no doubt succumbed to the usual harshness of deep space. The flight to Delta 7 was swift. Their vessel was a small transport shuttle, built for short runs between station and asteroid clusters. Shezin sat near a window, gazing at the swirling field of debris that shimmered faintly in the darkness. A few times, she overheard some of the security officers whisper about the old stories of Terran vessels that ventured too far. She refrained from interjecting, though her mind churned with the typical skepticism. It was her nature to doubt, especially where humans were involved. Upon landing near the coordinate of the derelict hull, they disembarked into the low-gravity environment. Shezin's boots, magnetized at the soles, clung to the rough ground. The crater they stood in was bleak and cratered with micro-impacts. Spidery shadows from overhead machinery spanned across the lifeless rock. Before them lay the partial remains of a hull, pitted and blackened, with sections caved in. Strange to think that if it truly was a Terran ship, it might once have carried living souls across the void. The Odari engineer, Rago, was already scanning the area with a portable sensor rig that hummed faintly. I'm picking up some unusual power fluctuations, he remarked. Power fluctuations? Asked Shezin. There's no way any system is still active. The metal's practically dust. I'm just telling you what I see, Rago said defensively. Also, the environment readings indicate some remnants of organic matter inside, possibly a sealed compartment. That piqued Shezin's attention, so she advanced carefully over the broken plating. All around her, she recognized antique fittings consistent with Terran design, rectangular brace supports, old steel rivets, and defunct thrusters that had not been standard in the galaxy for centuries. They made their way into what might have once been a cargo bay, half collapsed. Then they found the sealed compartment Rago's readings indicated, a curved hatch with scorched edges. It took them a few minutes with specialized cutting tools to open the hatch. A gust of stale air hissed out, only to dissipate quickly in the vacuum. The interior was cramped and half buried under debris. Shezin saw steel crates with stenciled letters in old Terran script. Much of it was illegible, but a few letters stood out. S.T. R-7. She tried to recall if that signified a known Earth-based company or some interstellar shipping brand from the 27th century. Meanwhile, the security officers began to fan out, scanning for hazards. Rago carefully lifted a warped sheet of metal with mechanical pincers. Ariana, look here. Behind that sheet, they found a battered data core. The housing was cracked, but not wholly destroyed. Shezin's interest soared. Perhaps this would confirm or disprove certain myths. She helped Rago hoist the core into a container for transport back to the shuttle. It was then that a sudden static ripple passed over her suit's visor. Something flickered near the corner of her eye, like a fleeting silhouette. She turned sharply. Nothing, just darkness. Returning her gaze to the others, she realized they had also paused, scanning the gloom. "Did anyone see that?" asked one Haloran guard, clenching a small plasma sidearm. The other guard shook her head, uncertain. They concluded it must have been a stray reflection or a glitch in the visual feed. They hauled the data core out, sealed the cargo compartment, and retreated from the wreck. On their way back to the shuttle, Shezin couldn't escape an odd sense that they were being watched. An irrational thought, obviously, but one that nagged at her. She forced herself to attribute it to the tension of exploring an ancient Terran hull. Once they returned to Athena Edge, Shezin participated in an initial attempt to analyze the data core. Rago used every technique he could muster: partial reconstruction, bypassing fried circuits, and scanning for stored logs. The result was a jumbled mess of fragments. However, in that mess, they caught a fleeting sequence of images: a man, unmistakably Terran, moving through what looked like a corridor without a standard helmet. The environment data in the corner of the feed indicated dangerously thin air pressure. Yet the figure strode calmly, apparently unaffected. The file ended abruptly, leaving only a flicker of static. "Must be tampered with," Shezin said, though she lacked her usual conviction. Or maybe a mislabeled environment reading. "Humans would perish in vacuum, just like the rest of us." "I see no evidence of tampering," Rago replied, though it's possible the instrumentation was failing. Shezin nodded, half distracted. Even if it was instrumentation failure, the footage gave off an eerie sense of possibility. She shrugged it off as an anomaly, then saved the clip in her personal archive, intending to examine it later. She had no time to dwell on it, because station business quickly took over. The science leads insisted on a thorough cross-check of every snippet of data, and Shezin's official job was to compile a small side report. None of these tasks, of course, did anything to shake her disbelief in extraordinary human feats. But things around the station took a bizarre turn over the next few days. First, the artificial gravity in certain corridors flickered for just a few seconds at a time, sending a few unsuspecting staffers floating near the ceiling. Then, the environmental controls in Lab 3 swung from near freezing to uncomfortably warm in mere minutes, with no rational explanation. Technicians scrambled, yet they couldn't find the cause. Shezin wondered if it was sabotage or a malfunction in the station's aging systems. She also heard rumors from panicked research aides that they spotted a figure darting through those corridors whenever the lights flickered. Much to Shezin's annoyance, the rumor mill latched onto the idea that a human ghost roamed the station, someone from the old wreck who had arrived to reclaim it. Ridiculous, she thought. And yet, deep down, she felt that same uneasy twinge she'd experienced on Delta 7. She ignored it as best she could. Late one evening, Shezin was finalizing details of her major report, the very one meant to debunk the legends of human resilience, when her desk console beeped again. She sighed, expecting it to be Ina or another colleague. Instead, the voice that followed was a clipped tone from station security, informing her of an unauthorized presence in the station's main data archives. They wanted her to come because the intruder apparently accessed files labeled human mythologies, which were under her name. She arrived in the corridor outside the archive room to find 2 Haloran guards standing tensely, weapons at the ready. The door was sealed from inside. Shezin, mild shock in her voice, asked them, "How long has it been locked?" "Maybe 5 minutes," one guard replied. "We think whoever's in there gained entry by bypassing the standard retina scan. That's a serious breach." Shezin keyed her clearance code to override the lock. The door slid open with a hiss. Inside, the large room was lined with flickering monitors and tall data stacks. At first glance, it looked empty. The overhead lights were dim. A quiet hum of electronics made the place feel claustrophobic. Then, in the far corner, she saw a shape kneeling by one of the data terminals. He stood up slowly, turning to face them. A man, humanoid, roughly average height, wearing a nondescript utility suit patched with strips of unknown fabrics. His face was partially shadowed. Despite the tension, he seemed almost relaxed, as if he had simply been caught browsing. The Haloran guards raised their weapons. "Who are you?" Shezin demanded. "This is a restricted area." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her with an odd glint in his eyes, stepping sideways with the grace of a predator. Shezin caught a glimpse of the terminal behind him. It displayed references to the archival footage from Delta 7 and also some bits of her own research. He had been reading about the so-called impossible feats attributed to humans. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said at last, his voice level, though Shezin detected the slightest tremor. "I just needed to see what you've gathered about my people. Your station's security is simpler to crack than some others I've encountered." "Your people," Shezin repeated. It clicked at once. "So you're human?" His expression gave him away more than words could have. He nodded, a wry smile flickering across his face. "The name's Ethan Ward. And yes, I'm Terran, if you want to be specific. But let's skip the introductions. You do better to call off your security. I've done nothing except read." One of the guards barked a command. "Hands where we can see them." He complied, lifting his arms slowly, though Shezin noticed the guards looked nervous, possibly from the rumors swirling through the station. A real human? A real intruder? But how had he gotten aboard? Shezin stepped forward, ignoring the pang of fear in her gut. "Look, Mr. Ward, I don't know how you got here, but you can't just—" She was cut off by a sudden alarm that blared through the corridor. Over the intercom, the station's automated voice announced a critical systems malfunction in the external defense ring. Everyone froze, exchanging concerned glances. The defense ring was the station's primary shield array, essential for deflecting cosmic debris. Without it, a large chunk of rock could easily pierce the hull. The alarm indicated something was heading toward Athena Edge, a significant piece of drifting asteroid matter, and the defense ring wasn't fully operational to repel it. Shezin heard the voice of Commander Terek come through her earpiece, shouting for all hands to gather in the control center. The meltdown of the station's systems had clearly escalated, overshadowing even the threat of an intruder. "Secure that unknown person," Terek added, "but get the rest of your team to E-Block. We need emergency repairs right now." One guard moved to confiscate Ethan's gear, but he suddenly sprang back, agile as if the reduced station gravity had no effect on him at all. The guard nearly stumbled over a cable, though the second guard aimed to stun her. Shezin, feeling a surge of exasperation, intervened. "Stop," she snapped. "We don't have time for this. Ethan Ward, if you plan to remain on this station longer than 5 more minutes, you might want to help us fix the system meltdown or watch us all get obliterated." Ethan's gaze darted around as though weighing his options. "Fine," he said shortly, "but only if you promise not to shoot me the moment it's over." "Deal." Shezin nodded to the guards, who lowered their weapons with visible reluctance. She then turned on her heel and hustled out of the archive room, motioning for Ethan to follow. The group half ran, half floated along the corridor as the artificial gravity flickered again. Here and there, lights dimmed, casting shadows that leapt across the walls. They reached the control center, a wide hexagonal chamber lined with consoles that displayed an incoming image of an asteroid chunk, perhaps 60 meters across, drifting steadily closer. The station's defense ring needed a direct infusion of power from the main generator, but evidently some key conduits were failing, forcing them to do manual repairs in an external module. That process typically required advanced spacewalk gear and a half-hour's time. They had maybe 15 minutes before the chunk would be close enough to pose a critical danger. Commander Terek was barking orders. "We can't rely on the maintenance drones. Something is corrupting their controls. We'll have to patch that power line manually from the outside." Shezin surveyed the stony chunk on the screen. It wasn't large enough to wipe out the station entirely, but it could tear a hole big enough to depressurize entire decks. They needed that shield. Ethan stepped forward, ignoring the suspicious stares. "If you only need the external lines reconnected, I could do it," he said. "Where's your nearest airlock access?" "Who are you to volunteer?" Tarek demanded, glaring. "We've got no time for standoff, but I can't just trust." "I can go out with minimal gear," Ethan cut in, voice intense. "That means you don't have to wait for the complicated suits. I promise I can handle vacuum conditions for a short time." Shezin felt her heart lurch at his words. This was precisely the sort of claim in old Terran legends that she had spent her career dismissing. Yet here it was, offered as a real solution. The notion was insane, and the commander clearly thought so too. But they had precious little time, and none of their engineers would dare suit up in less than 15 minutes. The guard next to Shezin whispered, "We can't believe him. He'll just sabotage everything and escape." Shezin fought back her swirling thoughts, focusing on logic. She turned to Tarek. "We have limited options. Let him try. If we lose the station either way, what do we got to lose by accepting help?" Tarek gritted his teeth. "All right, human. The external lines are through the auxiliary hatch. We'll be monitoring you from in here. If you even blink in the wrong direction, I'll blast that hatch shut." A strange tension pulsed in the air. Shezin caught Ethan's eyes, wondering if he was truly about to walk into near vacuum with minimal protection. The old legends flashed in her mind. Humans continuing to function in extremes, driven by adrenaline, or so the stories claimed. She'd always dismissed it. Now she was about to see it. They rushed to the auxiliary hatch, a corridor ending in a sealed double door. Inside the small supply closet, Ethan found a partial suit, really just a chest harness and helmet with a short oxygen supply. No full pressurization, no standard insulation. He strapped it on methodically, rolling his shoulders as though preparing for a strenuous exercise. Shezin's scales would have crawled if she'd had any. Instead, her Ilori eyes blinked rapidly in alarm. She stood at the observation window, flanked by Tarek and half a dozen others. Through it, she saw Ethan cycle the airlock. Then, with the station's exterior cameras capturing each move, he emerged onto the hull. The battered reflection of starlight gave a faint glow. She realized his face was partially exposed to near vacuum once he removed the helmet's visor to manipulate some junction with bare hands. Her chest tightened at the sight. He moved quickly, nimble as if the temperature fluctuations and the risk of pressure drop were secondary concerns. She heard Tarek's voice in her earpiece. "What is he even doing? That junction's half fried." "Quiet," Shezin replied. "Let him work." On screen, Ethan pried open a panel. A swirl of frozen atmosphere escaped, crystals dancing in the low gravity. She saw him grip a cluster of cables, tears forming in his eyes from the biting chill, or perhaps from vacuum dryness. He held his breath. No, that was impossible. No one could hold it that long, Shezin thought. She'd read countless medical references stating humans could last maybe a couple of minutes, best case, even with training. But he was surpassing that as minutes ticked by. From his vantage, Ethan was hooking up a bypass circuit to feed power to the defense ring. The clock in the control center read 8 minutes, 9 minutes. Shezin couldn't breathe. The chunk on the radar drew closer, looming menacingly. At minute 10, Ethan pressed a final lever. The readouts on the control console flared green. Power was rerouting. The shield generator's reading spiked from 40% to 90%. Another minute to fully charge. Meanwhile, Ethan's chest was heaving, and little droplets of blood floated away from his nose in the vacuum. Shezin's heart hammered. Then, with a final gesture, Ethan slammed the external panel closed. A surge of bright azure flared around the station as the shield engaged. Seconds later, a large fragment from the asteroid chunk slammed into that shield and ricocheted harmlessly aside. The entire station shuddered from the sheer force, but no catastrophic breach followed. They had survived. Inside the control center, a stunned hush fell. Then a wave of relief. Tarek sent an immediate retrieval signal to let Ethan back in. Shezin raced to the hatch, heart in her throat. When the door slid open, he collapsed onto the corridor floor, helmet half off, breathing in ragged gasps. Frost rimed his eyelashes, and his lips were bluish. Two medtechs rushed over, scanning him. Shezin knelt, ignoring the chaotic flurry of motion. You did it, she managed, voice hushed. She saw then, in vivid detail, evidence that he had just endured near-lethal conditions. And yet he was still conscious. One medtech rattled off vital signs that, while unstable, were far from what Shezin would have expected from an asphyxiating patient. Adrenaline, perhaps more. The tattered remains of her skepticism waged a desperate battle. She found no words to express how impossible it should have been. They carried Ethan to the medbay. Under normal circumstances, Tarek would have put in a cell first, but the man had literally saved the station. The moment they stabilized him, the staff was able to see that his lung alveoli showed stress that should have inflicted permanent damage. Yet somehow the tissue was regenerating or compensating. Shezin stared at the results in a daze while a medic, Dr. Jimty, tried to explain them in terms that made sense. None of it really did. When Ethan finally opened his eyes about 3 hours later, Shezin was sitting by his bedside. She had so many questions jammed into her mind that she could hardly form a coherent sentence. He studied her with that same calm, though he looked exhausted, battered, and 4-line fed some nutrient fluid into his system. I guess I owe you thanks, she said quietly. Without you, we'd be cosmic rubble. He exhaled, a faint grin twisting his lips. I'm just glad I didn't miscalculate. 1 second longer out there, and I'd be floating in a vacuum, unconscious. Shezin nodded slowly. I need to understand, she said at last. I've spent my life reading about so-called human miracles. I've dismissed them all as overblown myths. And now, in a single day, you've undone every assumption I've had. Ethan coughed, shifting to a more comfortable position. I'm no miracle. We humans are far from gods, trust me. But some of us can push beyond normal boundaries, especially after centuries of, let's call it, refined adaptation. It's a long story. A story I'd like to hear, she said, voice trembling slightly. Why are you on a thin edge? How did you stow away? Are there others like you? He pressed a hand to his forehead. There's a reason humans ended up being the subject of so many rumors. Partly, it's our own fault. We historically boasted about feats we pulled off during crises. But there's also a kernel of truth in them that other species rarely understand. We had to adapt on a planet with savage extremes. Some of us took that to another level, physically or psychologically. I can't speak for all humans, but I was recruited by an organization that travels the frontier. We watch how the Union handles places like this. Sometimes we help from the shadows if it means preserving crucial knowledge or saving lives. I was on Delta 7 investigating that old Terran ship when your team showed up. So I followed you back. Needed to confirm something in your archives. Shezin's mind whirled. So he hadn't simply appeared by accident. He had actively boarded Athena Edge. Your organization must be formidable, she said. And you're living proof that at least some of the impossible legends might not be so impossible at all. You can't imagine how many times I've heard the word impossible, Ethan replied wryly. He coughed again, wincing slightly. But let's be clear, I'm not immortal. I get hurt, bleed, nearly die. Maybe we humans are just too stubborn to accept limitations. Then we find ways to survive things we shouldn't. Shezin nodded, a part of her wanting to press him for endless details, but the expression on his face was so weary that she refrained. You saved us, she said. I won't forget that. Before she could continue, Commander Tarek entered, face stern. He's stable. The medic nodded, so Tarek crossed his arms. Human, I don't know what your real motives are, but you have my gratitude for preventing that disaster out there. That said, I can't just let an unauthorized presence remain on my station without explanation. We'll need a statement. Ethan glanced sideways at Shezin, who gave him a small nod. Commander, Ethan said, I have no interest in harming your station. I only wanted some data. Now that it's done, I'll leave you in peace. And how do you plan to do that? Tarek demanded. We're in deep space. No passenger lines come through here, but once every few months. I'll figure something out, Ethan answered cryptically. Commander Tarek sighed, evidently too overwhelmed by the crisis they'd just averted to press matters further. He left the room, leaving Shezin alone with Ethan again. She had 1,000 questions swirling in her thoughts. There was a part of her that wanted to call up every log of human legends she'd ever read and have him explain them one by one. Another part wanted to keep him here under observation, to verify if all the physiology she'd studied was incomplete. She suspected that might not go over well with him or with the station's officials. In the next couple of days, the entire station reeled from the aftermath of a near disaster. Maintenance teams scrambled to reinforce the battered external modules, and multiple staffers visited Ethan in the med bay out of pure curiosity or gratitude. The rumor mill, previously so excited by ghost stories, was now ablaze with accounts of how the mysterious human stepped outside in minimal gear to fix the station. Shezin overheard them comparing notes. He must have mechanical implants, or maybe he's genetically altered. She had no idea if that was true. Ethan didn't volunteer the details. For her part, Shezin started reviewing her entire, nearly finished paper. She had titled it Human Legends, a compendium of folklore and collective exaggeration. The arguments now felt hollow in light of what she had seen. That last scene of Ethan hooking up cables, enduring extreme cold and vacuum, was more than a rumor. She had witnessed it. She felt the weight of her skepticism crumbling. Eventually, when Ethan was strong enough to walk around, she invited him to her office. He arrived quietly, stepping inside and letting the door slide shut behind him. She motioned for him to sit, but he chose to remain standing, arms folded across his chest. She could see faint bruises on his skin from vacuum exposure, but somehow he radiated energy as if his recovery had been swift. "I can't ignore the truth of what I've seen," Shezin began. "So, I'm going to delete this entire piece of work that I've spent the last several months creating. My findings are flawed." He raised an eyebrow, perhaps surprised by her candor. "You don't have to do that on my account. A lot of those so-called legends are still exaggerations. Humans have a knack for tall tales. And yet you just proven that at least some of it is real," she countered. "Or at least it's real for you. Which means I was wrong to dismiss it all outright. I'm an academic, Ethan. I can't in good conscience present a paper that claims your feats are impossible." He exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "Sometimes people cling to impossible just because it's convenient. They don't have to grapple with new realities. You, on the other hand, are willing to reconsider. That's admirable." She lowered her gaze. "I'd like to propose something. You've got secrets, some clandestine mission or affiliation. I won't pry, but if you permit it, I'd like to run some tests, gather some data, see for myself how your body recovers so quickly. It wouldn't be invasive, I promise. We could do a simple physiological reading. That data might let me rewrite my research into something more accurate, more objective." His eyes flicked from her to the cluster of scanning devices around the room. "And in exchange, I won't turn you in or ask Commander Tarek to lock you up," she said. "You're free to remain under my observation for as long as you're comfortable. After that, you're free to go." He regarded her in silence. Then he gave a short laugh. "That's quite the offer. Honestly, I was planning to slip off the station, but maybe I owe it to humanity to let you see the bigger picture. Some of our stories are exaggerated, yes, but we do have capabilities that your average xenobiologist can't fully explain. If you want data, sure, but keep it discreet. I don't need the entire Union hounding me." She smiled, relief washing through her. "Discreet, of course." She paused, running a hand over her pale brow. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry I ever laughed at these accounts as if they couldn't hold a shred of truth. Maybe I needed an encounter like this to broaden my perspective." Ethan nodded. "We can all get trapped in our own assumptions. Besides," he added, "I've come across plenty of other species who can do things that humans find astonishing. Telepathy, flight in heavy gravity, all sorts of advanced biology. Why not us? Everyone's got something to offer." In the days that followed, Shezin carried out a handful of discrete tests, scanning Ethan's baseline vitals, measuring his reflexes. She confirmed his alveolar tissue had partially collapsed during the vacuum exposure, only to rebuild in ways she had never documented. He possessed extraordinary tolerance for temperature extremes. Even his synaptic responses, while well within known human ranges, seemed to spike to unusual peaks under stress. She was careful not to push him too far, recalling how fragile the line was between studying a phenomenon and exploiting it. The last thing she wanted was to turn him into a lab specimen. Of course, station authorities wanted a thorough explanation. Commander Tarek demanded a statement about Ethan's presence, but Shezin persuaded him that Ethan's knowledge and assistance were invaluable. Tarek granted them a window to finish repairs and wait for the next passing supply vessel, which might give Ethan a safe ride out. In that window, Shezin managed to rewrite large portions of her paper, adjusting the tone from condescending dismissal to a cautious exploration of humanity's rumored adaptability. She even changed the working title to Human Potential, a re-evaluation of so-called legends. In doing so, she found she had far more questions than answers. She no longer saw the old stories as laughable. Instead, they appeared as signposts pointing to phenomena that had a kernel of reality. Not that every tale was real, some were still nonsense. But now she recognized the possibility that humans, in the right circumstances, could accomplish feats that other species might deem physically impossible. She had coffee, well, the station's synthetic equivalent, one afternoon with Ethan in her office. He wore a borrowed uniform and looked much healthier. She took the chance to show him an old clip from her archives, a rumored historical event where an unarmed human fought off a predator triple his mass on an alien world. The data was incomplete, but it suggested the human surge of adrenaline might have allowed a short burst of strength to break the creature's neck. "That's exactly the sort of legend I used to mock," Shezin said, eyes drifting between him and the screen. "But now I wonder how far adrenaline or some innate crisis response can go." He regarded the images quietly. Adrenaline can do amazing things. So can raw desperation. But most humans wouldn't do that in everyday situations. We're vulnerable, too. She nodded. "I see that. It's just everything I thought I knew is shifting." Before he could respond, a station-wide broadcast flared to life. "Attention, docking bay personnel. Unscheduled ship requesting temporary berth. Access code verified as a small private freighter." Ethan's face grew tense. Shezin shot him a questioning look. He shrugged. "Might be a supply runner. Or might be my ride." They left her office to investigate. The docking bay had a modest airlock where a dusty, worn freighter had just set down. Its hull was battered, sporting no official union insignia. A hush fell as the bay crew approached, including Shezin and Ethan. The freighter's hatch opened, and a single figure stepped out, an older man with a leathery face, wearing a similarly patchwork set of gear as Ethan had. He gave Ethan a knowing nod, ignoring the rest. Shezin deduced this was a contact from that secret organization. The older man identified himself only as Axton. "We heard about the trouble you ran into," Axton said to Ethan. "Figured you might need a pickup." Ethan shrugged, his expression unreadable. "You're just in time. The station is safe, but I've been discovered." Axton eyed Shezin. "And this is?" "Shezin Ariana, Ilori anthropologist," Ethan introduced. "Without her help, I wouldn't be alive." Shezin felt a flush of mixed feelings. "I might say the same about you, Ethan. You saved the station. I only gave you a chance to do so." Axton's eyes flicked between them. He looked resigned more than friendly. "Well, if your business here is done, we should get going. Unless you prefer to stay." Ethan hesitated. Shezin realized this moment was the pivot. Would he vanish with Axton, leaving behind only a swirl of rumors? Or would he and Shezin find a way to continue the unique research that had begun? She found herself hoping for the latter, surprising as it was. She still had so much to learn from him. But before she could speak, Tarek arrived, accompanied by station officials. Tarek made it clear he intended to let Ethan leave, provided he never again bypassed station security. He emphasized that the station would keep a record, but for saving them, they wouldn't press charges. Shezin bit her lip, thinking. She stepped forward and addressed Tarek. "Commander, if Ethan is willing, I'd like to propose an official arrangement. Let me finalize a new research study on human adaptability. If the Council sees that It might overturn centuries of incomplete data about Terran physiology. That's no small thing. Tarek gave a non-committal grunt. If the human wants to talk, fine. But if he chooses to depart, I won't force him to stay. Shezin shifted her gaze to Ethan. I'd welcome your help, even a small contribution. Let me present real data to the Union, data they won't dismiss as fantasies. Show them the truth that humans can do things beyond what we once deemed possible. A flicker of conflict passed across Ethan's features. She suspected he had responsibilities, secrets to keep. Finally, he inhaled. I can't stay forever. There are reasons I can't be too public. But you've been honest with me. If you want a more thorough record of what we can do, maybe I can come back here, or we can meet somewhere more discreet. Gather your data in controlled conditions, so it's undeniable. That might help your cause and ours. People in the Union have the right to know who we really are, not just the legends or the half-truths. Shezin felt a bloom of relief. It was more than she'd dared hope. She nodded, stepping closer, lowering her voice so the watchers wouldn't overhear. Thank you. Even partial data will be enough to begin a new conversation in the academic world. Then let's call a promise, Ethan said. I'll be in touch when the time's right. Until then, do what you do best. Keep asking questions. She managed a small laugh. I will. She raised a hand, a gesture of farewell. I suppose you should go. But if you vanish forever, I'll personally track you across the galaxy. He chuckled softly. I doubt you'd be the first, but I'll make it easy and come back before that happens. He turned toward Axton, who gave Shezin a brief nod and retreated into the freighter's hatch. Ethan paused on the threshold, glancing over his shoulder. By the way, next time someone claims a human once outran a sandstorm that buried an entire city, maybe keep an open mind. She parted her lips to retort, but found she had none. With a final wave, he disappeared into the freighter. Moments later, the vessel lifted off, swiveled around, and darted into the darkness beyond the station's external gates. She stood there, struck by the realization of how drastically her worldview had changed in a short period. Not so long ago, she had been prepared to submit a paper confidently debunking everything about human legends. Now, not only would she rewrite that paper, but she felt an odd eagerness to see just how deep the truth ran. Commander Tarek dismissed the gathering, and Shezin returned to her office, mind abuzz with possibility. She stared at her old drafts. All the phrases mocking human mythologies seemed arrogant. She highlighted entire blocks of text and deleted them. Then she opened a new file, titled it Human Potential, A Reevaluation of So-Called Legends, and began typing with renewed passion. She recounted the events, the meltdown of the station's systems, the incoming asteroid, the desperate moment of externally repairing the shield, and the improbable success of a single human volunteer. She described the medical results, how she'd personally witnessed Ethan's vitals, the alveolar recovery, and extreme cold tolerance. Every piece of data she had gleaned, she typed carefully, wanting to be as thorough and honest as possible. Now that she had seen the reality behind the hype, she found it even more astonishing than the original legends. Overblown stories always had a kernel of truth, and that kernel was bigger than she had ever realized. She felt a sense of humility, recalling the scornful laughter she had once directed at the idea that a human could endure vacuum with minimal gear. She had laughed, until one appeared right before her eyes, defying her convictions in a flurry of raw determination and adaptation. In the quiet hours of that evening, she wrote until her eyes burned. The station lights dimmed to night cycle mode. She sipped from a canister of water, then pushed aside the old references to triple-check the new data. She had transcripts of the med team's findings, partial sensor log from the hull repair, and a first-hand account from her own eyes. The facts were overwhelming and, for a moment, left her exhilarated. At length, she rubbed her temples. A single question gnawed at her. How many other impossible feats might be real? The stories of humans lifting cars, holding their breath underwater, crossing deserts without rest, might each be grounded in the same intense adaptability that Ethan had displayed. Or perhaps each was a different manifestation of that same trait. She didn't have all the answers, but now she was certain it was an avenue worth exploring. She typed a final line for that night's entry. Witnessing an event that contradicts one's established assumptions is the rawest form of learning. We can only grow when we allow ourselves to see what we believe to be impossible. Then she saved the file, feeling oddly at peace. Sleep came easier than she expected. In the following days, the station's life gradually returned to normal. The meltdown crisis was resolved, and the staff busied themselves with routine checks. Shezin sometimes found her mind drifting toward thoughts of Ethan. She wondered if he was truly part of a widespread Terran network, if there were hundreds or even thousands of humans quietly traveling the galaxy, sometimes revealing themselves in dire circumstances. She suspected that soon, more glimpses of legends come to life might surface in other corners of known space. As she strolled the corridors, staffers would greet her politely, though she noticed some gave her curious glances, likely aware that she had been in direct contact with the station's most talked-about visitor in recent memory. She offered no more details than necessary. She had promised Ethan she would be discreet. Instead, she let them puzzle over the intangible question. Was that an actual human being who can do the impossible, or are we all dreaming? Sometimes, an upstart researcher would come by her office, brimming with new rumors about humans. Some story from a data crystal about a man wrestling a giant sea beast, or a woman leaping from a low-orbit platform and surviving. Before, Shezin would have offered a quick, brusque explanation of how the rumor was unsubstantiated and likely misinterpreted. Now she only said, "Let's examine that carefully. Maybe there's more to it than we realize." In doing so, she felt that her entire career had taken on a new direction. No longer was she the debunker, the cynic who sought to tear down illusions. Now she approached each legend with genuine curiosity, determined to discover which fraction might ring true. The entire station's data logs from the meltdown and the subsequent vacuum repair were locked, but she kept her own private copies in case she ever needed them to persuade the council. Finally, the day came when the official supply hauler arrived, bringing fresh staff and materials. Commander Turek organized a small ceremony to acknowledge the heroics that saved the station. He presented Shezin with a commendation for her decisive thinking in an emergency, which made her blush slightly, because the real credit belonged to Ethan. Turek refused to mention Ethan's name in the official log, partly from caution. No one wanted to provoke complicated questions from the union's bureaucracy. But Turek gave Shezin a meaningful look that said, "I know who really saved us." She accepted the commendation with a measured expression. Then, when she returned to her office, she pinned the small ribbon to her desk board. She found it ironic that she had earned formal praise for an act that wouldn't have succeeded without a near-mythic human legend stepping up. The next day, she concluded her rewriting of the new research paper. It was a beast of a document, over 70 pages, brimming with references to medical logs, anecdotal accounts, and her first-hand observation. The final paragraphs held a respectful but urgent tone. Galactic knowledge regarding Homo sapiens is incomplete and partially incorrect. While they may share an average baseline with many species in the Union, certain individuals display remarkable responses to stress, environment, and physical trauma. This capacity for adaptation suggests that many older Terran legends should be reevaluated, not dismissed outright as fantasy. She titled it, "She Laughed at Human Legends," until one appeared right before her eyes, a nod to her personal journey from skeptic to believer. She had a feeling the title was dramatic, but it perfectly captured her transformation. Perhaps, too, it would catch the attention of the academic board and spark the conversation she believed needed to happen. In a private afterword, she dedicated the piece to Ethan Ward. "Without your intervention, this research and its author would no longer exist." She locked that private note from public view, uncertain if he would ever see it, or if he'd eventually come back as promised. But she hoped truly that he would. There is so much more to uncover about human potential, and she was only beginning to scratch the surface. At last, She released the paper to the station's internal network, confident it would find its way to the council. A wave of relief and excitement washed over her. She might face controversy, possibly ridicule from those who still clung to the old stance that humans were nothing special. Yet she was ready. She had the data to back her claims and a real story that no inquisitive mind could easily ignore. Night cycle fell once again, and the station lights dimmed across the habitat ring. Shezin flicked off her desk console and stared through the small porthole at the distant stars. Somewhere out there, Ethan and his clandestine peers were moving on. Perhaps they were on another station, or traveling to another remote outpost. Perhaps they were saving more lives. She could only guess. She pressed her palm to the window, letting her breath fog the surface. It struck her how vast and mysterious the galaxy still was, and how many stories, both real and imagined, existed in the hidden corners of cosmic dust. Once, she had prided herself on her ability to cast scorn on myths, to slice them up and discard them. Now, she longed to find more truths behind the legends. She was no longer just a skeptic. She was a seeker, newly awakened to the possibility that the line between legend and reality might be far thinner than she had ever dreamed. She whispered softly, "I won't laugh at those stories again, because I've seen one walk among us." With that vow, she let herself finally rest, her mind at ease, knowing that the next step in her intellectual journey had begun. If Ethan truly returned, or if more humans emerged to display feats that defied her old frameworks, she would meet them with open curiosity. The illusions had fallen away, leaving something far more wondrous. And in that wonder, Shez and Ariana felt more alive than ever before.